day. Today we have topic 3 for Political Science 100, Behavioral Approach and the Political System. So this is just the second of the many approaches that we will be discussing in this class. An approach that helps us understand political phenomena. For this lecture, the following are our learning objectives. First, identify the origins and core assumptions of behavioralism. We specifically contextualize the behavioral approach to its rise in the 1960s and its subsequent implications to the discipline of political science and the practice of political analysis and research. Second, we discuss the application of behavioralism and behavioral analysis in political science research. Next, we will also tackle one of the most classic frameworks in political science, David Easton's theory of political systems. First, we review the previous approach. Political science has traditionally been taught this way, as the study of the art of government. As we have discussed, this only entails the study of constitutions and governmental arrangements. There are some limitations to this approach, as we have also discussed. First, there's the danger of simplification and reductionism. Political phenomena is reduced as being inside an arena, which is the government and the state. We have discussed this when we discussed the meaning of politics. The traditional legalistic approach misses so much about politics, especially politics that takes place outside the realm of the government. Second, the danger of ethnocentrism. As early as now, we must be aware that most political science concepts and studies are done in the West, specifically Europe and the United States. Most prestigious institutions hosting political science departments and most political science scholars are also concentrated in the West. The implication of this to the discipline is that most of the time, only Western types and kinds of governments are studied. This may sometimes be not applicable to the context of non-Western countries, like for example, the Philippines. Also, contexts always matter. For example, the Philippines has a presidential system of government. We cannot say that this presidential and unitary form is similar to that, for example, of the United States, which is a presidential system but instead follows a federal system of government, unlike the Philippines. For many years, federalism has been pushed by some groups in the Philippines, but we must take note that the US and the Philippines has different contexts. This is sometimes not discussed when the traditional legalistic approach alone is used. The culture of the people having a similar form of government with another country must still be studied, not only in the tenets of what a normal form of government looks like, but also in the context of what makes their form of government different, based on their difference in context. Third, the danger of the value biases and classification. So it's related to the second. We can classify governments as totalitarian, democratic, etc. Democratic governments, in theory, are deemed the best form of government. We must, however, take note that it is not a perfect form of government. Communist governments are also automatically seen as evil, an evil form of government. We must go beyond classifying to also go beyond these value biases. This is also an implication of having too many Western scholars writing about political science and about other countries. Finally, classifications in this approach are state-bound. As we have said, politics go beyond the state and can be seen within the society within a state. The traditional legalistic approach is highly state-centered. These limitations are the reason why we should discuss other approaches in political analysis. Today, we start with behavioralism or behavioral analysis. If you remember from one of our earlier discussions about the evolution of political thought through time, we said that in the 1950s and the 1960s, there was this movement that pushed for more focus on the science part of political science. The science of politics argued for a more scientific method of doing political research. This movement was led by those who adhered to behavioralism or those who used behavioral analysis in their research. Particularly David Easton, proclaimed that politics should adopt the methodology of the natural sciences. The adherence to this thought by a generation or more of political scientists, starting from the 50s to 60s, marked a revolution in the discipline of political science, aptly called the behavioral revolution or the behavioral movement in political science. Behavioralism's main aim as an approach is to use rigorous statistical techniques in the analysis of political data. Primarily, this is because it advocates for the use of natural science methods in the study of political science. This is why this approach is mostly leaning towards quantifiable data or the use of statistical analysis. Some examples of studies that use this approach are voting studies. At face value, this approach to studying political phenomena has a pretty simple set of core assumptions. We will discuss these core assumptions one by one after this slide. As per Haywood, behavioralism is the belief that social theory should be constructed only on the basis of observable behavior, providing quantifiable data for research. From this statement alone, we can see the theoretical and methodological orientations of this approach. Take note of the following terms: observable behavior and quantifiable data. So these are very important in understanding behavioralism. Behavioralists have one major question in their social inquiry or research: why do people behave the way they do? For them, social inquiry is fundamentally about trying to understand what it is that some people do, think, or say. In the last module about power, we learned about political actors. In behavioralism, the actions and behavior of these actors, may it be in the level of the individual or the social aggregate, that are directly observable are the primary concerns of research in the political science. This emphasis of this approach on the observable can be traced to its roots on positivism, with its focus on empirical testing. When we say directly observable, these pertain to behavior that can be easily observed when we are studying about something. Say, for example, here, voting. It is easy to observe people going in to vote in precincts or people attending politicians' campaigns. In the Congress, for example, you can observe how laws are being deliberated by the members of the House of Representatives. All observed data can now be used to answer the question, why do people behave the way they do? The implication of this question and the insistence of behavioralism in studying only quantifiable data is that social scientific research can only be done when there is observable behavior. You cannot presume why a person does something if you do not have actual evidence. This is where positivism comes in. Where did the behavioral approach get the idea that only observable data are valid for scientific inquiry? What does it mean to be positivist? Positivism originated as an intellectual movement associated with the writings of Auguste Comte, a prominent sociologist who aimed to appropriate the methods of the natural sciences to the study of social sciences. Positivism, thus, is the theory and that social, and indeed all forms of inquiry, should adhere strictly to the methods of the natural sciences. An implication of this is that the results of the study of social scientists or of political analysts could be empirical. That is to say, they could be tested against observation in order to see if they were true or false. This is consistent with behavioral approaches focused on observable behavior or on empirical behavior. It should be directly observed and can be observed again to test whether it is true or false. This means that a statement should be falsifiable. How does this work? To understand this, let's go back to the scientific method, something that I am sure we have encountered as early as primary school. Positivism simply is the view that the scientific method can be used in studying the social sciences, including political science, or in the case of behavioralism, studying political phenomena can be studied through this method. The very basic steps of this method are the following. You start with observation, then you formulate a question that can be set as the reason as why you're studying a certain topic. You form a hypothesis, you do a test, or an experiment based on several variables to either accept or reject your hypothesis. And based on the results, you draw a conclusion. In this sample, for example, you are a plantita looking for the best type of fertilizer. You now then test different types of fertilizer, and based on your observation, okay, the plant that grew the tallest or the healthiest, you will draw the conclusion that, for example, here, A is the best type of fertilizer. So we apply that to the study of political phenomena. Now, think about that scientific method you use to find the best type of fertilizer out there. And think of the question of behavioralists, like why do people behave the way they do? Since they subscribe to positivism, this means that they believe that the scientific method is applicable to the study of people, meaning you study people by observing, forming some kind of hypothesis regarding their behavior, testing whether you can see your hypothesis in reality through observation, and then draw results from your observation. So you can see here, it's like putting the society under the microscope, if that is possible. Drawing conclusions from observable behavior is what we are referring to when we say empirical. The actions of these people are observed by this, for example, political scientists, and that is what is empirical. So based on your observations, you now draw generalizations or a conclusion. When you can study something empirically, that also means that you can test whether the observation is falsifiable or can be replicated. We'll discuss the concepts mentioned here in a minute. So basically, studying people through the methods of the natural sciences. When we say natural sciences, we refer to physics, chemistry, biology, and the like. So as an approach, it has, aside from aiming to use statistical analysis for its study, these are also some of the main aims of behavioralism as an approach, consistent to positivism. First is to provide an empirical theory, and second, to provide an explanation for political phenomena. So an empirical theory is a set of interconnected abstract statements consisting of assumptions, definitions, and empirically testable hypotheses, which purports to describe and explain the occurrence of a given phenomenon or a set of phenomena. A scientific explanation is a causal account of the occurrence of some phenomenon or a set of phenomena. An explanation of a particular class of events consists in the specification of the minimum non-tautological set of antecedent necessary and sufficient conditions required for their occurrence. So behavioralism as an approach uses positivism in its study, seeks to provide an empirical theory and an explanation for political phenomena. So here, an empirical theory is not just based or is not just confined or specific to behavioralism alone, because other approaches have assumptions and definitions. So what's apparent and what's distinct to behavioralism is their insistence on empirically testable hypotheses. So we'll see, we know what is empirical, okay? So we'll see in a bit what falsifiability and replicability means for behavioralism. Coming from that idea of empirical observations, we can infer the following key assumptions of behavioralism as an approach. First, general covering laws can be inferred from specific empirical observations. Behavioralists put premium on observation, particularly empirical observation and testing. This just means that in doing research, one should be able to exhaust all data based on observation. Furthermore, the data and the subsequent findings of the research is capable of being falsified, meaning that you can test your findings and compare it to the real-world setting, that is, empirically. Related to this is behavioralism's emphasis on causation. Falsification of a statement can be stated as if A, then B, then if not A, then not B. So if A, then B is causation, like that having A causes B. So if you falsify something, or if you can falsify something, meaning you can observe in the real world whether A really leads to B. Okay, so this statement can only make sense if A and B are properly defined empirically. Second, political behavior exhibits regularities over time which allow law-like statements to be generated inductively. This inductive reasoning is implicit in the scientific method. So we go to defining what are laws and what is inductive reasoning in the following slides. to better make sense of what these key assumptions are. So we now go to inductive reasoning. As with the scientific method discussed earlier, you have an observation first, and from that you form a generalization, which will serve as your theory. So in short, like you have specific observations, like for example, you observe this many people vote in a specific day or a specific hour. So that's an observation. You form a generalization through that. Like for example, you form the generalization that most people tend to vote early in the morning during the day of the election. And then you have a theory. So what will be your theory after that? So this is inductive reasoning used by behavioral analysis, again, particular to the general. Because they observe political behavior and notice regularities, meaning they observe and they see that, for example, some people behave the same way, those are regularities. They assume and generalize that it must be true and applicable to all. So that's what we mean by generalization. For example, surveys show that Filipinos usually get political information from the television and social media. They get information on political candidates or even the programs of the government. They get information from the television more than schools or family, meaning they get news more or political information more from social media than from their own family or schools, which are also places where you can get political information. You can thus theorize that Filipinos are affected by what political information are available in the television and social media, or that they may be susceptible to propaganda that are prevalent in these platforms. So that came from your observation that most of our ideas about politics came from social media, and you know how social media is, right? So you can generalize that most people get their information from there, and then you can formulate your theory based on those generalizations from your specific observations. Deductive reasoning works the other way. You start with a theory. So for example, you start with that theory that, oh, people are susceptible to propaganda, and then you test your predictions of whether this can be observed in reality. Then you go to social media and you go maybe from house to house and ask people what they think about certain issues. And then that's when you see the specific applications of your general theory. So it works the other way. So we will see deductive reasoning at work and the other approaches that we will discuss in the next few weeks of this class. But for now, behavioral approach is a kind of inductive reasoning. So again, to just reiterate, behavioralist analysis works with the inductive reasoning. For behavioralists also, no a priori assumption should be allowed to inform political analysis. This means that hypothesis here in inductive reasoning should only be based on prospect observation. This means that you do not let a theory dictate your results. You follow the scientific method religiously. For example, it is your hypothesis that people vote only for members of political dynasties because of either vote buying or because they have known the family of the candidate for the longest time. If your results say otherwise, for example, you were in a municipality with no political dynasty and they elect a new mayor from a different family every election, then you do not change your results in order to follow your hypothesis. Theories, however, could guide empirical research such as in behavioralism. But again, theory should never define or restrict the results. So in the course site, there is a video that was posted that distinguishes between a theory and a law. So I urge you to watch that so that you can understand this part of the video or the recorded lecture better. In science, you have the theory of relativity and the law of gravity. What's their difference? So in political science, you also have theories and laws, like for example, the theory of political instability by Samuel Huntington and the iron law of oligarchy by Michels. So you will see these laws and theories throughout your journey as a political science minor. So it's important as early as now to distinguish the difference between a theory and a law. So to understand what a theory is, however, you need to understand its constituting elements or components, which is concepts. So concepts make up theory. Okay. Concepts are the building blocks of analysis, or a mental construct, or a word that stands for an idea resulting from a generalization process applied to a number of specific concrete instances. So if we use behavioralism as an example, we have said a while ago about the specific observations. You have specific observations. The way to organize those specific organizations is through concepts. Okay, so for example, if you see people protesting, if you see people protesting about a certain issue, there are several concepts that can house or can organize your observations. Like for example, a protest in itself is a concept. Okay, there are several related concepts to this idea of a protest. Because if you do not know the concept of a protest, what you see is just, a number of people or a large group of people going to the streets with placards shouting. Okay, the way to organize that in one specific and one distinct word is a protest. Okay, so that's a concept. Okay, so if you have many concepts, because they are the building blocks of analysis. If you have many concepts that have a distinct relationship to each other, for behavioralism, it's usually causation. Causation, meaning A causes B, A leads to B, A influences B. You can have a specific theory. So a while ago I said, or I had an example of a theory that maybe people are being influenced by the political information or propaganda that they see on social media. Okay, propaganda is a concept. Social media is a concept in itself. So the relationship of these concepts can now be a theory. So you must remember of concepts as a data container. So examples of concepts are concepts that we have already discussed in the past few weeks, which is state, power, and politics. So the connections or relationship of concepts are found in theories, or the statements about the connection between one concept and another. That's a theory. Theories either explain causation, X causes Y, or correlation. Theories may be born from observations as well as predictions. If a theory is correct, for example, we may be able to explain why a certain thing happens. For example, A happens when there's B. In another instance, we can expect A to happen when there isn't B. Okay, so if you have a theory, you can explain other similar phenomena through this theory. Okay, so for example, when you theorize that people are being affected by propaganda from social media, you can then use that theory, okay, to either predict, for example, if you want to, actually Facebook and the other social media, specifically Facebook actually, and other social media or social networking sites have tested this, like what or how do people respond to political propaganda. Okay, so do they engage more with the content, or do they just stop and not believe in that content? So there are studies that are actually being used illegally that shows that people are being susceptible really and vulnerable to political propaganda, especially if you engage in the same kind of material over and over again. So it will shape your perception about something. So if that's your theory and then you want to experiment that, though it's illegal and it's also unethical, you want to experiment how certain propaganda will affect people in a specific country, then that could be one way of validating your theory, because your theory explains connections between concepts. Okay, so a law, on the other hand, has a certain level of certainty to it. It also explains what happens, but a law is something that is always applicable. So the law of gravity is always applicable, for example, whether on Earth or on other planetary bodies. but in different intensities, of course. It has gained acceptance from the scientific community through decades or centuries of observation. A theory, on the other hand, does not claim this universal applicability. Like, for example, our theory, for example, that people are susceptible to propaganda, it's different for everyone. There are people who are not easily swayed by, for example, content posted on social media. So we cannot generalize that for everyone. So this is the same for other social sciences. Because we're dealing with people, we cannot accurately predict what will happen. Okay, unlike natural sciences, well, that they work on very controlled environments. Like, for example, they can control what bacteria to study, what animal to study, right? So it's important to know this distinction between concept and theory versus law. So in the case of behavioralism, they wanted law-like statements, but of course that is not possible. But in order to go to that level, they need to be able to use the natural sciences, or the role, um, they need the natural sciences. Okay, so the scientific method, for example, they need the scientific method so that they can go at this level of law-like statements. But again, in the social sciences, it's very rare that something is accepted by all scholars or by many people. Okay, so in your journey as a political science minor or a social science um, major, okay, uh, you find theories and laws and see how their concepts explain reality and how these, in a way, predict reality, how these theories predict reality. So that's the aim of behavioralism. So you must take note, however, that behavioral analysis also has predictions. Behavioral analysis assumes that because there are regularities in a set of data, then you can generalize this beyond the immediate context and time period in which that data is collected, in order to formulate law-like statements about political behavior, as I've said. Most of the time, however, behavioral analysis, or any social analysis for that matter, do not claim or cannot claim that it can make laws, only theories. Take, for example, the previous example of inductive reasoning. If in the study you observe that people in the Philippines usually get their information from the internet and television, you can assume this for people in other countries too, given the prevalence of these platforms in other countries. This will be validated once you do the same study in other contexts. Another key assumption of behavioral analysis is that neutral and dispassionate analysis is possible. As it uses the scientific method, it says that there is no bias in their analysis. Why is this important? Scientific studies get their merit from being objective. When a study is as objective as possible, without bias, or being subjective, it is more acceptable. Take, for example, Einstein. Imagine if he said that the theory of relativity is something that he conjured from his dreams, or he said it is his opinion. Then no one in the scientific community will believe him. But since he backs his theory with evidence and observation, and now humanity is slowly proving his theory right through actual evidence in space, his theory is generally acceptable. But it has not it's not considered a law yet. But this just shows how natural science has claimed objectivity throughout the past few centuries. And it is also what behavioralism wants for its analysis, to be objective so that it can be considered a law or considered acceptable. So some key concepts that were mentioned in the previous slides are the following. So some of these have not been discussed specifically yet, so we will discuss them one by one. So let's review them to have a better understanding of behavioral analysis. We'll also try to provide examples. So we have causation, empirical observation, generalization, falsifiability, induction, and replication. So one concept that we have mentioned is falsification or falsifiability. So behavioral analysis encourages the use of empirical study. As discussed, this means that they focus on observable behavior. A crucial component of empirical analysis is the falsifiability of the results of a study. Take this statement as an example. In general elections, people vote against the incumbent government if they are dissatisfied from its performance. This may be a theory forwarded by one researcher working on voting studies. This statement, for behavioralists, should be capable of being falsified by means of empirical observation. For falsification to proceed, we should know what the variables or concepts in this theory is. Like for example, we need to know now what is dissatisfaction and what is voting. So for example, voting means support to a political party by giving them a vote in the context of an election. So dissatisfaction, for example, can mean that they do not like the policies they do not follow. So that could be dissatisfaction too. So now that we have definitions, okay, based on our context, so what we did is operationalization. So that's what we did. It is only then that we can say that this statement is capable of falsification. Though, according to Sanders, 2010, we might hope that it will not be falsified because, again, behavioral analysis wants its results to be generally acceptable and objective. So it needs to be also applicable or also real and true in even when you are doing the test or doing the empirical testing again. Okay. It also helps to add that behavioralists have a theory first before empirical observation. One's theory may guide a researcher on what to observe or study empirically. So even though we said that behavioralism uses inductive reasoning from particular to the general, a researcher must have like a theory at the back of his or her mind so that he or she knows what to observe. Okay, so falsification means that you observe again. Okay, so if you do the study again, like for example, voting, you study the voting study again, a researcher may be capable of falsifying or saying that, oh no, your results are wrong or results are false. Okay, but the aim is that it should not be false. It should be something that happened in reality. Okay, so generalization. So we have discussed a while ago in detail a law or theory. So behavioralists, because of their inclination to use methods of the social sciences or the natural sciences, tend to make generalization or laws, but in the context of political phenomena. So again, that is like a dream of behavioral analysts because in the social sciences, it's practically impossible to make a law. But for them, if you use the natural sciences, and their methods, use the method of the natural sciences, then it's possible to come up with a generalization that is law-like. So it's not really a law, but law-like. Okay, so behavioral analysis can be replicated. So behavioralists are very clear on the model and methodology that they use in their studies that can be replicated even in other contexts. So this is related to falsifiability, actually, that you have a study, another person can do it and observe what you have observed and say whether what you have claimed in your results are true or not. So it's the same here. You can replicate it. So the major aim is to make empirical theories and explanation that are scientific in nature. Studies of voting behavior or political participation, for example, try to understand the behavior of people and their attitudes towards the governments. A study from the US, for example, can be replicated in the Philippines using the same variable and problem. So, because they aim for universality, they aim for like general acceptance. They want their studies, for example, to become generally accepted. So if you replicate it, it must yield the same results, but it's not like that in reality. You can replicate the study, but sometimes or most of the time you have different results. So regarding method, behavioralists tend to have a bias towards quantification because of their desire for political science to be more scientific. Quantitative methods like statistical analysis, however, is not the only method used by behavioralists. By using such methods, behavioralists claim that they are value-free as they conduct research based on impartial observation. So as a summary of its assumptions, so basically behavioralism seeks to explain political phenomena, and they want to do this through having an explanation that is capable in principle of being tested against the world of observation. So we have discussed in detail why this is so. So to better understand this approach, let's look at some of the representative works in behavioralism and how they have applied behavioral analysis in their studies. First is Robert Dahl. You may remember him from the definition of power. He studied decision-making, or the process of making laws or decisions, in New Haven, Connecticut. He observed that there seems to be a plurality of interests and that no one is able to dominate decision-making there. By implication, the same was true at the broader national level. This made him infer the definition of power as well as the generalization that there are plural interests and decision-making in governments tend to consider all of these interests in decision making. So his is an example of induction, so particular to general, because he studied New Haven, a singular place in the United States, and inferred or generalized that this must be true in all other parts of the United States too, or in the world even. Ted Gurr, in his work Why Men Rebel in 1970, discusses his theory of discontent and relative deprivation. According to this theory, when people perceive or feel deprivation, when they compare their situation with that of others, that they are motivated to join in mobilized protest actions. This perception of feeling is relative deprivation when there is a discrepancy between what you expect to life and what you think you deserve versus your value capability or the things you can achieve in life. Widespread perception of relative deprivation leads to discontent, which tends to lead to politicization of discontent, which then leads to political violence. Take, for example, indigenous peoples. For centuries, many indigenous peoples have been fighting for their land against incursion from both government and public entities. Relative deprivation theory can explain why some of these groups resort to protest to fight for their land. As with the rest of the people in our country, for example, they expect that their rights to their land will be recognized by the government and that they can live peacefully without military aggression. However, they perceive that they have relative deprivation because unlike other people in the country, they have been unfairly treated and their lands militarized so that the government or mining companies can deny them access to their lands. They may have appealed formally to their local governments but to no avail, so they perceive their value capabilities as lower than that of their value expectations. Ted Gurr's analysis uses behavioral analysis as this explanation can be inferred from observation and can also be applied beyond one spatial and temporal context. Included in Gurr's theory is rising expectations. Protests can also be explained by what people compare themselves with, that could further reinforce their notion of relative deprivation. Gurr notes that the potential for collective violence would be greatest in a nation most of whose citizens felt sharply deprived with respect to their most deeply valued goals, had individually and collectively exhausted the constructive means open to them to attain those goals, and lacked any nonviolent opportunity to act on their anger. Like the indigenous peoples in the previous example, there may be no other means for them to air their frustrations. Media and education can also be a source of rising expectations as information from these channels can be a way for people to realize their relative deprivation. An ideological belief can also be a source of rising expectations. This is why the Philippine government, for example, always accused farmers of being part of the New People's Army or as communists, because the ideology of groups like this can actually change a person's perception of his or her value capabilities. Finally, a group may compare their situation with other groups. The feeling of unfairness may push them to have more expectations and fight for what they believe they deserve. The result of rising expectations and relative deprivation are sometimes revolutions. Revolutions become more likely when expectations have risen, owing to some limited reform process after a long period of intense deprivation, but then expectations are crushed. King, Keohane, and Verba in 1994 supplements and supports behavioral analysis through their notes on social science research, saying that indeed, scientific inference should be used in social science research. Inference means attempting to infer beyond immediate data to something broader that is not directly observed. As we have discussed, results of social science research must ensure falsifiability and replicability of results. It should also use public methods, meaning that the procedure for researchers should be public and should use explicit, codified, and public methods to generate and analyze whose reliability can therefore be assessed. This means that we cannot use methods that are not scientifically sound and accepted. Taking note of these things will not only make you understand behavioralism more. It will also make you know what you need to do as a student of political science and social science. Our researches are always evidence-based, not based on opinions or ideologies. Behavioralism is not a perfect approach, of course. It has several limitations. First is the problem of differentiating causation and correlation. X leads to Y. It's not always the case that this is the result of the research. Sometimes behavioralists do not differentiate causation and correlation. Second, it tends to restrict itself to visible variables and to those that can be directly quantified. As stated here, behavioralists tend to favor more quantitative methods because of their emphasis on empirical observation. A critique to this is that it narrows political science's scope and could be taken to mean that behavioralists only focus on what could be observed. In the last module, we talked about insidious power and the idea of interests. Interest can be very hard to observe, and thus behavioralists may shy away from discussing such. There may be other factors that are not directly observable but affect political phenomena. Also, by focusing on quantifiable data only and using only statistical analyses, behavioralism does not tackle traditional political science concept. Haywood laments the lack of focus of behavioralism in the traditional political thought, specifically that focused on normative theory. Normative theory, or the theory of what ought to be, and the topics of liberty, justice, etc., sure has no place in behavioralism with their emphasis on empirical observation. They insist, though, that unlike positivists, they do not think that normative statements are meaningless. These are just other forms of knowledge and understanding. Third, their focus on the status quo and assumptions of regularity cannot explain social and political change. A critique to the approach is that it may underestimate the importance of more profound social and political changes because that might be taking place because they focus more on observations. Fourth is the lack of conception of agency. Behavioralism, as mentioned, only observes. It does not explain really why people behave the way they do. Instead, explains what they do. Lastly, it suffers from a narrow conception of politics and power. With all this, we can conclude that it also has a narrow conception of politics and power, basically because for it to observe political phenomena, it needs to focus on what is observable, excluding other topics in politics that are not observable. So we now go to the framework of David Easton, which is the political system. So we have mentioned David Easton in the beginning of this presentation as the scholar who said that political science can be studied scientifically. To reiterate, Easton argues for the need to develop a general, empirically oriented theory as the most economical way in the long run to understand political life. From this argument, we can see here his adherence to the tenets of behavioralism. For Easton, a political life can be characterized as a system of interrelated activities. A system can be defined as an organized or complex whole, or a set of interrelated and interdependent parts that form a collective identity. So, according to Easton, political system is the subject matter and should be the unit of analysis in political analysis. Nonetheless, the political system is not the only system in the society. There are others that it has interactions with such as cultural system, social structures, economic system, demographic system, and international social system. When we say it's a system, it has parts, okay, and these parts has functions. Okay, so we will see what the system, how the system works for Easton in the next slide. So this diagram illustrates the system that was theorized by Easton. This model is the political systems model attributed to Easton in his book The Political System in 1953. It tackles the process of decision making in a society through systems analysis. The formula is you have inputs here that goes inside the political system, or in other books it is called the black box because you do not essentially know what happens inside here. That will now produce outputs. Okay, so you have these outputs. Inputs are made by the society or the general public. So imagine that this environment is the whole of the society. So here people are outside. Okay, so inputs are from people. So these are in the form of demands or support. Like for example, in Baguio City, people are demanding that there is a part of the city that demands that tourists be not allowed to go inside the city. So that could be a demand. So this demand will go inside the political system. Okay. So this undergoes the process in the political system, the black box. This will translate to decision or policies as outputs that will serve as the feedback to the inputs made by the society. So if the demands of the people is that tourists be not welcome in Baguio City, then the government must come up with a decision or policy that either support the input or is against the input. So it's not always positive, all right? So inputs and outputs are the so-called units of the system. The cycle will recur in the society as needed. So these decision or policies will now return to the people or who gave the inputs as feedback. Okay, so this is feedback. So for example, the current policy of Baguio is that they still let tourists enter because it's, and they also got permission from the national government to do it. Okay, so that's their response, kind of response to the demand. So according to Easton, the system is crucial for the long-term equilibrium or political stability of the system. It is also a prerequisite that outputs are in line with the inputs. Okay, so in a good system, decisions or policies are in line with the demands or the support. But since we do not know what's happening inside this political system, at least according to Easton, it's not always the case that these are aligned. Okay, so just think of the demand for mass testing in the Philippines before, which is an illustration of how the political system is sometimes not working. So the environment is the context of the inputs and outputs and may differ from one society to another. So for example, right now, many of the countries may have different, the same environment in the case that we all are facing the COVID-19 pandemic still. Okay, so in many of these societies, they have you will have the same inputs, but you have different decisions or policies of government. So right now you have governments that have bought vaccines already, but in the Philippines, the vaccines have not come yet. Okay, so this is the idea of the political system by Easton. So it's his theory of it is framework for political analysis. So there are videos online about the political system, so you can check those, or you can ask questions if you do not understand anything, or if you have if you do not understand anything, or if this is somehow not clear to you. So, and that concludes our kind of long lecture about topic 3, behavioralism and political system. So it's kind of long because it's the first full-blown approach that we will be discussing, because we needed to explain what is inductive analysis, what is empirical. So for the next few readings, I hope that you are able to grasp these concepts better. Okay, so if you have any questions, put them in the comment section here or ask them in our VLE. Thank you.